Welcome to this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on state policy and the family, looking at the impacts of policy on childhood. In our previous videos, we've looked at the different theoretical views of family policy and the policies introduced by different political parties. However, we also need to consider the impacts of social policies on different aspects of family life. This is a common question on the AQA A-Level specification, particularly when tackling the 10-mark outline and explain questions, which rely upon a student being able to apply their knowledge of one area of the specification to another. In this video, we're going to look at the impacts of policy on children. Now, there are two different forms of policy to consider here. Firstly, direct policies, ones that have the explicit aim of changing the experience of children in some way. For example, the Children's Act, which aimed to provide legal protections for children. The second type of policy to consider are indirect policies. Now, these are a little trickier as their aims aren't associated with changing the experience of children. However, an unintended consequence of them being put into place is to alter children's experiences in some way. For example, the austerity policies, such as cuts to benefits, they were intended to repay national debt, but have disproportionately impacted on the lives of the poorest children in society, with estimates that austerity policies have resulted in the number of children living below the poverty line increasing to over 4 million. In this video, we'll be applying policies to different debates within childhood, which should help when tackling the 10-mark outline and explain questions. First of all, we need to identify some of the changes to childhood, and then look to explain how social policy has influenced these. One change is that we have seen an increase in the dependency of children upon their parents. The likes of Brooks have suggested that we live in a cotton wool society, and we need to consider how policy has facilitated this. A second argument about childhood is that it's disappearing, a view put forward by Neil Postman. We could also look here at how childhood has become toxic based on the work of Sue Palmer. A third debate is the extent to which society has become more child-centred, and we can examine reasons for children no longer being seen as mini-adults, but as part of a wider focus on the family as a unit of consumption. And finally, we need to consider how policies have impacted on the different experiences of childhood, based upon social class, gender, ethnicity, and so on, and how policy appears to have changed children's experiences in these areas. The policies we're going to discuss are focused on the UK. First of all, we'll look at how social policies have impacted on the way that children have become dependent upon adults for longer. And a key aspect of this is the extent to which young people are unable to financially support themselves at the age of 18 or 21, as they might have been in previous generations. One policy that has impacted on the ability of young people to be self-sufficient is the changes to funding for higher education. Cuts to student grants and increased tuition fees have meant that many young people are leaving university with large amounts of debt. This has led many students to go to local universities, and rather than living independently, they will live in their family home to reduce costs, thus increasing the burden upon their families. A second consideration here is the changes to employment. Those that don't go to university, or once they've graduated, will look for employment, and employment is more insecure, and this is because of the form of zero-hour and temporary contracts, which leads to a generation of what are called boomerang kids, who return home when their precarious employment ends, or because they're unable to afford rent or mortgages because of the insecure nature of the job market. This is due to employment legislation that protects the interests of businesses to manage their own staffing costs. A final explanation for children being dependent upon parents for longer is the extension to compulsory schooling from 16 to 18, introduced in the latter days of the new Labour government. Coupled with the removal of EMA, this has meant that young people in education are financially dependent upon their parents for a further 2 years, although many would suggest that this continues far longer. A further area of childhood to discuss in relation to social policy is the disappearance of childhood. Now, there are links here to the education module with the impacts of marketisation and the constant pressure of standardised assessment on children's mental health, and the insistence of parents and teachers that students are concentrated on their education far earlier than in the past. You could examine the impacts of SATs, for example, at 7 and 11. An indirect policy is the range of austerity programmes that were rolled out under the coalition and Conservative governments that has disproportionately affected children from lower social class backgrounds. Cuts to lone parent benefits, introduction of universal credit, caps on benefits, etc., have all meant that children may be suffering from shortages in food, holiday hunger, and living in worse accommodation. Reductions in social care provision have also seen an increase in the number of child carers, while cuts to children's mental health provision have meant longer waiting lists for treatment. Furthermore, increased conflict for children, particularly of those children who are from divorced or separated families, has been influenced by policies such as the Divorce Reform Act and the creation of the Child Support Agency, leaving children in the middle of conflicts between former partners. However, there have been some policies that have attempted to address the issue of protecting childhood, most notably the Children's Act, providing children with legal rights. One of the arguments for society becoming more child-centred is the reduction in the number of children, and this can be linked to policies that focused on providing women with greater control over their reproductive rights. For example, the legalisation of abortion and the availability of contraception on prescription, which reduces the number of unwanted pregnancies. An indirect policy that has impacted on the number of children is the greater equality in the workplace for women, with policies such as the Equal Pay Act and the Sexual Discrimination Act leading to more women having career aspirations and choosing to have less children or having children later in life, or even choosing not to have children at all. A final policy that has an indirect impact on child-centredness is the marketisation of education, encouraging greater parental involvement in a child's education, from selecting schools to providing support for them throughout their education, as parents want their children to have advantages in society. An example of this is what was referred to as helicopter parenting, with parents being more involved in the educational aspects of a child's life, amongst other factors. A final link between social policy and childhood is the impact of social policies on the different experiences of childhood that children from different social backgrounds will have. One policy that disproportionately impacts on children from minority ethnic backgrounds is legislation around immigration. With the current Windrush scandal, children from minority ethnic backgrounds are more likely to be separated from elderly relatives. Freedom of movement policies could also impact on children, with some parents working overseas for long periods of time or their grandparents retiring to sunnier climates. Looking at social class backgrounds, lone parents and working families have been disadvantaged by policies such as the bedroom tax, the introduction of the benefits cap, reductions in benefits with the introduction of universal credit, and cuts to other means-tested benefits such as free school meals and free transport. Social policies have also had an indirect impact on the gendered experiences of childhood as well. For males, the decline of traditional manufacturing in the UK as part of the Conservative government's privatisation initiatives has impacted on their future prospects and created a crisis of masculinity, particularly amongst young males. While job prospects for girls and changes in the structure of the British economy have led to an increase in girls' aspirations. Finally, children's experiences may be shaped by the family structures they live in, with changes in legislation meaning that LGBTQ families can be legally recognised and can adopt or have fertility treatment, which results in more children being raised in same-sex families. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video looking at state policy and the family, examining the impacts of policy on childhood. Thanks for watching.